came tonight. I thank you from the depths of my soul. Very nice of you. This is a beautiful night. A lot of people have chosen a different kind of entertainment, but we're happy to have with us tonight Carlos Hernandez Garces, a good friend of mine from the University of Oslo, who will give a talk about Aithie or Aithii in Herodotus Histories, exploring the space between predetermination and free will. Carlos has obtained multiple academic degrees from universities in Spain and is currently doing his PhD at the University of Oslo in the Department of UiO-IFIKK, History of Ideas and classics, right. And we're happy to have him here tonight. Carlos has a very eclectic work history. Apparently he has worked as an archaeologist for many years, starting with Ireland and then continuing in Spain, in different parts of Spain. He has also had a chance to work in Greece on two of our projects, Norwegian Institute projects, and I have to say it was with me, in Charistos and in the island of Iraklia south of Naxos. He has published mostly in Spanish so far, and has delivered several lectures in international fora. Carlos has uncanny abilities with languages that I've personally witnessed. It takes him about 3 days to pick up a new language, which is reflected here in both dead and alive languages. And again, we're very happy to have you here with us tonight. Carlos.
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for arranging this event and for your kind words of introduction. I wish it was true what you said about picking up languages in 3 days, but still it's very flattering. And thank you for showing up, those of you who have come today. So, to get around to matters, I will start by saying that, by speaking about a German-American scholar called Hermann Fraenkel, who published in 1931 an article that set the trend in the study of time in archaic Greece. In his search for evidence of the early idea of time in ancient Greece, he delved mainly into the Homeric poems. In his view, the absence of time terms, strictly speaking, led to the conclusion that in archaic Greece the idea of time was undeveloped. Fraenkel's contribution became from the start an essential reference in the field, but his assertion about an undeveloped idea of time was questionable, to say the least. However, it was not until 2002 that someone addressed the issue, which constituted one of the main pitfalls of Fraenkel's lexical analysis. In that year, Egbert Bakker's article Kleos and Ideology from Herodotus to Homer, and by the way, all the bibliographical references that I will be using are listed at the end of the handout in case anyone is interested in reading them after. So in this article, Bakker showed that there is a fully developed idea of time in the Homeric epics, only it is conveyed by means other than time terms. As he arguments, Kleos, or glory, encapsulates time in Homer. It is striving for immortality, as he puts it, what embodies the prevailing temporality in the epic poems. A temporality that unfolds on a forward, future-oriented axis. Unlike the Homeric poems, Herodotus' histories yield many occurrences of time terms. Nevertheless, the total figure of approximately 300 instances of Chronos, Kairos, Aion and Hora, mined from the text, are of little avail to unravel the intricacies of the idea of time underlying the histories. Instead, they correspond for the most part to practical aspects of how Herodotus structures the narration. For an in-depth understanding of the peculiar idea of time strapping down the histories, I am proposing that one needs to look beyond them, in the vein of Bakker's study. However, the pitfalls of Fraenkel's lexical analysis did not really work against the interpretation of time in the histories, since time terms do dot the text. What was more detrimental to it in tradition was the general assumption that the lack of a layer of theorization implies the absence of a certain idea. This is far from being so, but it often resulted in the low regard in which Herodotus was held as a thinker. What introduced the final step in rational thinking by drawing up theories on abstract ideas was philosophy proper as a discipline, but that happened sometime after Herodotus. This So, for instance, the evolution of the very term philosophy shows this nicely. In 130, Herodotus has Chrysos use the verbal form philosopheon to describe Solon's trips. That's example number 1 on the handout. 3 of the most widely used translations of the Histories are Macaulay's from 1890, a long time ago but still in use, Godley's, that is the Loeb translation from 1920, and Waterfield's, more recent, from 1998. They render it into English as to search for wisdom, love for learning, and love for knowledge, respectively. All 3 of them offer aspects associated with the practice of philosophy as it was to be known afterwards, but none of them ventures an outright translation as to be a philosopher. Another example of how ideas not formalized, yet theoretically, are nonetheless present in the Histories is etymology. Herodotus reflects on etymology here and there in the text, and occasionally he even makes deliberate use of it. He does so, for instance, in the so-called tragedy of Adrastus, which is the fateful episode where Chrysos' son goes to an early grave. In his commentary of this section, David Ashery, who published one of the most referential commentaries on Herodotus very recently, he sums up the scholarly take on the names Attis and Adrastus by stating the following, quote, "The very names Attis and Adrastus were thought to be symbolic, standing for misfortune, Ate, and necessity, Adrasteia, respectively." Well, we could debate about how suitable the translation of Adrasteia is according to Ashery, as necessity is rather someone who can't run away from himself, but that's beside the point right now. So it was Plato's Cratylus that first became a treatise on etymology proper, but it is obvious that Herodotus had an interest in the field as well. Naturally, Herodotus was dabbling in the intellectual trends of his time. Lately, in recent years, a number of studies have laid new focus on the links between Herodotus and his contemporaries. They have produced new evidence in order to place Herodotus among the thinkers of the 5th century BCE Greece in his own right. Prior to this, however, not enough attention had been paid to the topic. There always was a long-standing consensus that Homeric poetry and tragedy played an important part in Herodotus' composition, but few studies discussed Herodotus as a 5th century thinker. In recent years, though, some scholars like Kurt Rafflau, Rosalind Thomas, and Robert Fowler, among others, have put forth arguments tying Herodotus in with the pre-Socratic philosophers, the medical writers, and with the political and intellectual debates of his time. It was the last of them, Robert Fowler, who drew attention to a specific feature that is of crucial importance to my research. He put Aithea in the spotlight when he wrote that, quote, "The linking of Aithea and Historia, which suddenly appears in the writers of the 5th century, must be a contemporary development. The change in vocabulary, older writers spoke of dithysis and archai, seeking and beginnings, marks a change in the tenor of discourse. Aithea, hos, is a more abstract notion and one with greater explanatory power than beginning. Although in many of its instances in Herodotus and other writers, the word does not go beyond recognized legal or religious usages, there are some passages where the abstract principle of cause and effect is becoming explicit." End of quote. Truly enough, Herodotus' histories bear witness to the emergence of a process of abstraction from concrete notions. Several of them stand out because of the role they would play in Greek thought in decades to come. To quote an example relevant for what Herodotus does, apodixis would evolve from the concrete sense of display or even performance onto an abstract notion closer to demonstration, in the sense of bearing proof to something. As a matter of fact, this development already hovers distinctly over the histories. There are some other examples, but I am going to restrict myself to Aitheia's gradual process of abstraction today and in my research as well. And the reason why I have opted for Aitheia's is that it constitutes the catalyst of the characteristic temporality that informs the histories and therefore is pivotal to their coming about. So, summing up what I've been trying to say in these introductory words, the first point that I'm trying to make is that even if Herodotus does not offer a theoretical model about it, he defamiliarizes Aitheia's by enhancing its meaning with a more wide-ranging temporal significance, and he does so in accordance with intellectual trends of his time. So he endows Aitheia's with a new layer of significance and is something that was currently ongoing in thought at the time. And now let's take a look at how this translates in practice. I will move on by first looking at the common ways in which Aitheia's was used at Herodotus' time, and then by looking at how he added a new layer to it. So in 5th century BC Greece, one of the two contexts making more extensive use of Aitheia's was that of the courts of law. In the exercise of justice in the polis, the common practice consisted in allotting responsibility in cases of infraction of the law. The Oresteia by Aeschylus showcases how highly topical this was in Athens at the time. Regarded jointly, the Agamemnon, the libation bearers, and the Eumenides depict the transition from a tit-for-tat system of justice based on blood ties retribution to a system where the polis deals out justice under the dictates of the law, a system that made the citizenry equal in rights. In the courts of law, the party or parties held responsible for a misdeed were designated as aitios, a derivative of Aitheia's. In the histories, Aitheios occurs frequently when making someone responsible for a breach in the common agreements. The one that probably best epitomizes this is Herodotus' quasi-sentence of Ephialtes as guilty of showing the Persians the path bypassing the Thermopylae. In the law courts, the historian would hear out the arguments of all involved and would weigh them up before giving a verdict. And so does Herodotus with Ephialtes in 7:214-3. In those lines, after offering several accounts as to how the Persians discovered the passage of the Thermopylae, which is what led to the slaughter of Leonidas and the Spartans, he writes, and this is example number 2 on the handout: "But it is Ephialtes who led the Persians around the mountain by the path, and hereby I declare him responsible." The historian is therefore a judge of the causes of historical events. The link between the courts of law and the birth of history is commonly accepted, but please note here how even the phrasing "I write him down" may have been picked directly from the language of the law courts. Rosalind Thomas, in her 2000 publication, from the year 2000, not that she published 2000 books or articles, the publication is called Herodotus in Context, and she examines the connection between Herodotus and the law courts regarding language, and then she writes, open quote, "The language of proof, the claims to have demonstrated that such and such is the case, the claims for the display of the truth, the language of correctness, all lie alongside this first-person dogmatism attributable to the histor, be that in the exercise of the law or in writing of history." End of quote. Additionally, besides its use of the legalist, the employment of aitios as cause or origin is commonplace in the study of natural phenomena in 5th century BCE. For the slides, as you may have noticed in the one before, I took the liberty of using contemporary films and to show to what extent passing judgment on a historical character, as Herodotus does with Ephialtes, has an impact in posterity. Because even to this day, Ephialtes is still being reused in films, and even from the film there has been a cartoon made out of it. And likewise, when it comes to the point of natural philosophy, I chose the Amazon instead of the river Nile, which is what Herodotus deals with, to try and do an exercise in putting ourselves in the shoes of Herodotus, because even to this day there's still some debate about the source of the Amazon, and that is a parallel to the situation in which Herodotus may have found himself back in the day. The note at the bottom of the slide refers to an article on the topic for anyone who might want to read it. So logically, Herodotus partakes in the thought currents of his time, and he gives clear signs of his relation with the pre-Socratic natural philosophers. Rosalind Thomas, once more, formulated the underlying common trend in the following manner. Quote, "We can see points of contact between the histories and certain pre-Socratic natural philosophers of the 6th century Ionian Enlightenment, and they share a desire to make sense of the world in non-mythical and non-genealogical terms, which we would call rational." End of quote. Among the instances of rationalization of natural phenomena in the histories, a prime example is Herodotus' attempt to ferret out the true cause of the flooding of the Nile in the passages comprised in Book 2 between chapters 19 and 28. In the span of those passages, Herodotus deliberates at large about the explanations he was able to gather, for a total of 3. However, in each and every case, Herodotus produces counter-arguments disqualifying the theories as being off target, and then he goes on to propose his own explanation. Leaving aside the specifics of Herodotus' argumentation about the flooding of the Nile, I would like to draw attention to how he expresses himself as the judge determining the true explanation for the cause, aitios, of the phenomenon. This is example number 3 on the handout, and you can see that he uses aitios and not Aithia. I have therefore come to consider the sun the cause of this. And as I just said, in the original Greek he doesn't write cause as Aithia, but as aitios. And incidentally, the discussion on the flooding of the Nile is a case in point as well for another reason, because it also illustrates an important aspect of the relation between causes and events that will bear much significance in history. And I am referring to the factor of retardation, keeping cause and event at a remove from each other. In scholarship, the connection between Herodotus and natural philosophy has also received attention in recent years. Scott Emmons, one of the many scholars who devoted some work to Herodotus, in his discussion of the crucial work by Imervar's Form and Thought in Herodotus, he writes, quote, "Imervar devotes the last chapter of his book to the analogy between natural and historical processes in Herodotus. His view that history is for Herodotus a kind of natural process subject to the same governing forces as all other natural phenomena has gained wide acceptance. The gods are the guarantors of the workings of nature, as well as the objective correlatives of the functioning of civilization. The idea that the patterns of human life run along parallel lines with the laws of nature occurs in the earliest philosophers." End of quote. In addition to the correlation between historical and natural processes, what adds value to this quotation, on top of everything else, is that it introduces the category collective, which is condensed in the terms country and civilization, a notion that is indispensable for the conception of history as well. So, summing up again this part of my argumentation, the second point would be that the method of the histor in trying to unearth the truth in the courts of law, and truth in the courts of law equals Aithea. The truth is the responsibility, the guilty party, although I would like to refrain from using guilt, because guilt has connotations from Christian tradition that were not at play yet. The method of the histor, the search for the cause of natural phenomena in Ionian thought, are both conspicuously present in Herodotus' composition. The former, the role of the histor and the method of the histor, boils down to the transition from clan retribution to civil responsibility. The latter boils down to that just as natural events have causes that can be inquired into, so do human events. And also I mentioned that the awareness that in nature the causes may be remote from the events introduces a sense of temporal retardation that forces us to look for explanations beyond the immediate context, be that temporal or spatial. So on the one hand, the methods of research of the histor, the idea of Aithea as cause or responsibility, the apportioning of responsibility as in the courts of law, and that's the reason why I chose the image of the film 12 Angry Men, not just because I like it very much, but if you have seen the film you can see this process of like cutting up piecemeal the responsibility of the developments of the trial. So it shows very well this idea. So the apportioning of responsibility, the link between nature and man via the divinity, and the idea of retardation are all factors that largely inform the conception and the structure of Herodotus' histories. And on the other hand, the rationalizing wave in vogue at the time was adding layers of abstraction to known ideas. And this is precisely what Herodotus does with Aithea, as I will try to show. So far this is a bit like the ingredients I'm using to conduct my research on the text. So ultimately, the interest of Herodotus' historical account does not lie simply in recounting past events for the sake of generations to come. After all, every single account of the events of the war against the Persians told at Herodotus' time resulted by necessity in the same ending. The Greeks had come out victorious over the Persians. What Herodotus' text does is not to tell what happened, but how it happened. With Aithea as a compass, the histories refer to the quandary of why, in hindsight, what everyone expected to happen did not happen. From what can be gathered from Herodotus himself, the Greeks must have had a clear insight of the magnitude of the plight they were in before the actual combat, obviously. So not only did the Persians reckon that Greece was soon to be under their thumb, it did not escape the Greeks either that theirs was a lost cause. History has it that the musicians of the Titanic kept playing on as the boat was going under, and similarly the Greeks' decision to stand up to the Persians would have been a display of bravery as a way of taking the fall in style. In their own Greek style, that is, upholding their values and standing firmly on their convictions. However, events turned out differently, not only to the Persians, but to everybody's surprise. And the space Herodotus is interested in exploring is precisely the window where the decisions leading to the well-known outcome were being made. Herodotus is interested in the chink in the armor of time, where individual responsibility for events can be distributed. In order to highlight these turning points of the history, Herodotus conjures up the scenes of decision-making and their atmosphere. He reconstructs them by showing what the events looked like prospectively in the eyes of the beholders before the decision was made. And examples of this abound in the text. So firstly, in Book 1, the mismatch between the glorious prospects of Croesus and the catastrophic turn of events his life took was manifest. The best known episode is probably the one where Croesus, blinded by his vain hopes, fails to see the warning in the oracle's response to his question whether he should attack Persia or not. Indeed, the reply merely stated that, should he attack the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. And that's example number 4. Carried away by his hopes and without the benefits of hindsight, Croesus decides to make the offensive move, which will eventually backfire and bring about the ruin of the Lydian Empire. However, let's not get ahead of ourselves. In the last instant before setting the offensive into motion, Croesus takes counsel with one of his advisors, who speaks out against the attack. And this is the part where Herodotus incites his audience to step into Croesus' shoes and to look at their own prospects with caution. Croesus could have seen the good sense in his advisor's words and changed his mind, but he did not, as everybody in the audience was perfectly aware of. In the end, Croesus decides not to heed the advice and carries on with his project, which will result in his downfall. However, Herodotus has brought back to life for a fleeting moment the instant when Croesus could have seen reason and saved himself. By doing so, he appeals to his audience not to reenact Croesus' blunder. He is sending out a message for people not to take for granted the fulfillment of their own prospects, but to reflect wisely. And this implies in the Histories taking counsel. Normally these scenes imply taking counsel and listening carefully to opposing opinions. To round it off, Herodotus builds these literary acts of counseling in such a way that their language resounds with the terminology of the Athenian assembly, which would have helped to recreate the circumstances. Secondly, for a few chapters, starting from Book 7, Chapter 8, Xerxes assembles the Persian notables to communicate them his resolve to invade Greece and to hear their opinion about his determination. During this pseudo-democratic gathering, Artabanus, a Persian noble, tries to dissuade Xerxes from invading Greece. Among his arguments, he broaches on how the expectations of Xerxes' father Darius were not met when he attacked the Scythians. More to the point, he states how his father's miscalculation almost cost him his life. In this case, Artabanus, as a historian of sorts within the text, recommends caution to Xerxes based on his experience of past military campaigns. That's example number 5 from the handout. However, after much going back and forth with arguments, his sound advice is cast aside, and Xerxes, as absolutely everybody in Herodotus' audience knew, was defeated. And lastly, encompassing several sections of Book 8, Herodotus shows how Themistocles sways the Greeks in the right direction against the dictates of their prospective visualization of the oncoming event. To put things in context, in the hour of truth, after the Persians already burned Athens to the ground and the imminent fight at sea threatens to wipe out the Greek resistance, the general consensus is to retreat to the Peloponnese and to shelter behind the natural defenses of the Strait of Corinth. Themistocles, however, proves to have a better foresight, as he deceives both Persians and Greeks in order to hasten the outbreak of the battle. Indeed, the Greeks' prediction was too short-sighted, meant to see another day, but doomed in the long run, as they would have had to confront the Persians sooner or later. As for the Persians, they could have easily undercut the material resources and the resolve of the Greeks by letting the clock tick away while simply tightening up the siege. Themistocles tricks both parties out of their resolutions in the conviction that this would play out to the advantage of the Greeks, despite the appearance of the event to follow. And this is the key point. For the Greeks, in the run-up to the battle, facing up to the Persians would have seemed reckless, almost suicidal. Once more, however, the prospective interpretation of an imminent event proved wrong, As dawn breaks, the Persians venture into the straits of the shore of Salamis on what seems to be the final blow against the resistance. However, unable to profit from the numbers and being less seasoned sailors than the Greeks, the Persians are beaten. Now, with the Greeks had retreated, that crucial victory would have never taken place. Or if the Persians had known better and bided their time, they would have probably followed through with the invasion. So in all three cases, in Croesus' decision to attack Persia, in Xerxes' decision to invade Greece, and in the run-up to the Battle of Salamis, the real losers are their prospective expectations. Herodotus therefore incites the listeners or the readers to reflect on their own acts of decision-making and the prospects involved in them. He points at the impossibility to fathom all the possible outcomes and therefore not to be too assured about the future, despite what appearances may say. This unavoidably refers to the debate of whether an admonishing tone presides over the histories or not. Much has been said about how the text may be compelling the Athenians to depose their hostility in the context of the Peloponnesian War. A passage like 973.3, example number 6, where Herodotus refers openly to the Peloponnesian War, shows that the ongoing conflict must have been on his mind as he composed the work. Nevertheless, this alone does not suffice to prove that the underlying idea of the histories was to advise the Athenians against their belligerency. Likewise, the closing lines of the work in 922.3, and that's example number 7, where Cyrus speaks against undertaking military campaigns, have been argued to contain a subtle warning for the Athenians to put an end to their aggression. The issue remains controversial, but it seems sensible to draw attention to how the histories as a whole may constitute an invitation to weigh up very carefully the pros and cons of one's future actions, at least in politics and on events of the scale of an invasion. At its core, the invitation would have been circumscribed to the Peloponnesian War, but it could also apply to any similar circumstances. However, weighing up the pros and cons in any given situation and then making a decision requires the interpretation of the circumstances in question as well. And making a decision based on an interpretation contains a prediction that is liable to prove wrong even in a best case scenario of responsible foresight. Conversely, prophecy, as Koselleck famously put it, is history written in the future tense, so it is bound to happen. At the end of the day, both prediction and prophecy play capital parts in the history, always along the lines of obviously prediction as being largely uncertain and prophecy as being inescapable. So without theorizing about it, Herodotus explores nonetheless the role of Aithea or responsibility in man's struggle to become the master of his own fate in a backdrop of contingency and predetermination. He does so by establishing a domain wherein to reflect about responsibility or cause. Only he does not so as in tragedy, which is a genre populated by mythological figures, but through known historical characters, such as Croesus or Xerxes. More specifically, he does so by recreating the circumstances right before decisions are made, as that is the instant when, in hindsight, one can attribute responsibility. To make matters a little more complicated, in the intricate network of ideas related to cause at play in the histories, the judgment of the historian is also interwoven in the logic of the stories. And Croesus' Logos once more helps illustrate this interplay. In 190-91, Croesus sends emissaries to the Oracle of Delphi to demand an explanation as he blames the god for his downfall. That's example number 8. Instead of an explanation, what he gets is a scolding from the Pythia, who reminds him that it was actually down to him to interpret correctly the oracle he had received in response to his question whether he should attack the Persians or not. The prophetic words were correct, after all, and his attack had resulted in the destruction of a great empire, only it had turned out to be his own, not his enemies. However, at the same time, it had been prophesied much before that Croesus would be the last of his dynasty. So example number 9. This is the famous episode where Gyges, at the insistence of Candaules, the king of Lydia, sees the queen naked. The queen realizes what's going on, and she demands of Gyges to either kill her husband and become the king, or to kill himself, because no, it's not possible for her to, it's not decent to have been seen naked by 2 men. So at that time, Gyges sends emissaries to the oracle to ask for permission, so to speak. He asks whether it's all right for him to become the king, and the Pythia says yes, it's fine, but 5 generations after this, your descendants will suffer the revenge of the other dynasty. So therefore, there's a conflict between the insinuation that he could have diverted his ruin had he interpreted the oracle correctly, and the assertion found in 113.2 that he would be the last of his dynasty. It is paradoxical that Croesus should be accused of being responsible of his ruin, given the fact that fate had already determined that his dynasty should lose the kingdom during his reign. However, this is precisely the frame of Croesus' story, and by extension that of the Histories. Herodotus navigates the space between predetermination and free will, and he does so by apportioning the responsibility, in this case of Croesus' ruin, and by distributing it between the gods and the monarch. This is the embodiment in the Histories of the incipient rationalizing tendency at Herodotus' time. But there is further evidence of this in Croesus' Logos, and this is example number 10. In 187.3, as a response to Cyrus's question as to the reasons that moved Croesus to be foolhardy enough to attack the Persians, Croesus admits agency, but he denies responsibility. He says, yes, I did this, but the responsible party is the god of the Greeks, who cheated me into this move that was going to cause my downfall. So he pins responsibility on the Greek god, and then after that, in a highly unusual turn, also the god produces a disclaimer of responsibility for himself, and that is 191, which is example 11. In that passage, he produces a disclaimer indicating that, in fact, it was thanks to him that Croesus' downfall was postponed by 3 years, but not even he, a god, could divert fate from its course. The actors, therefore, tried to wash their hands off, admitting to their agency but palming the responsibility off on the impersonal notion of fate. However, Herodotus, through the Pythia, has already made Croesus responsible as being the one that misinterpreted the oracle. On the other hand, the judgment of the historian also intervenes to make Croesus largely responsible for triggering the chain of events that changed for good the reality of Greeks, Lydians and Persians. And this is what I will move on to now. So on this new plane, the historian will be overtly passing judgment on the sequence of historical events and pointing at those whom he deems to be responsible. So therefore, on the one hand, at the level of the plot, the characters explore the causes of the events that befall them, thus trying to historize their own lives, even if imperfectly, as probably we all do. On the other, at the level of the composition, Herodotus gives his verdict on the basis of his inquiry in his capacity as historian. So in Croesus' case, this means that the Lydian monarch was the first, the origin and the ultimate cause that put a threat on the independence of the Greeks. In the broader picture of the narration of the Persian Wars, this would not be a trifle. Herodotus is saying that what Xerxes carried out started in truth with Chrysos. The idea is condensed in Herodotus' use of protos, or the first, in 1:6. Indeed, after skimming over the skirmishes between Greeks and barbarians, Herodotus sets down the beginning of the episode that upset the status quo for good. He phrases the case in the following manner, and that's example number 12. This Chrysos was the first non-Greek we know of to have subjected some of the Greeks to the payment of a tribute, whereas others he won over as friends. So these few words contain two nuggets of precious information about the histories. Herodotus had already made use of both Aitheios and protos in the preceding chapters, but now he's not referring to here talk, but to knowledge, whence the use of the words in the original Greek idmen, we know. Additionally, he defines the loss of freedom he defines what the loss of freedom truly means as becoming a political vassal, condition that in this case was enacted through the payment of a tribute. Greek cities had been attacked or destroyed before, both by barbarians or by other Greeks. The difference was that the ravages of war had not entailed the loss of independence at that level. So what was a novelty about Chrysos' policy was that, unlike his forebears, who had been constantly fighting with the Greeks of Asia Minor, he offered the end of war in exchange for a tribute. That is to say, he was offering peace for political submission. Likewise, this was the essence of the Persian offensive, to put the Greeks under their rule, not necessarily to fight them. Had the Greeks accepted the Persian offer to give them water and earth as a token of peaceful surrender, they could have spared themselves the trouble of war against the Persians. Only they would have done so at the expense of losing their political independence, which at the end of the day synthesized their identity. What Chrysos had done was precisely this, but he had gotten away with this owing to the milder appearance of the conflicts between the Lydians and the Greeks of Asia Minor. Herodotus, however, pinpoints the similar trend and underlines it. Chrysos is the Aitheios, in depriving the Greeks of their finest achievement and their most defining cultural trait, their political independence. On top of that, in Herodotus' account, Chrysos effectively puts Greece on the map for the Persians to notice, even if unintentionally. The Persians would then follow Chrysos' example in trying to subjugate the Greeks permanently, and after them the Athenians would pick up the baton in trying to do to their fellow Greeks what the Lydians and the Persians had done before. In accordance to the spirit of the times, Herodotus challenges temporality, a temporality defined by oracles, divine plans and tit for tat, and takes the first unsteady steps in the exploration of the role played by humans in writing their own fate. As neither predetermination nor free will supply satisfactory answers to explain events, Herodotus drives a wedge between them by apportioning responsibility, thus opening out a new space. In order to do so, he endows the notion of idea with a new significance. He amplifies it, taking it from the spheres of natural philosophy and the courts of law onto the search for the causes of collective events. Interestingly enough, this implies a sense of economy of the responsibility that links also into notions of quantification, which are of Oriental origin. The importance of the development of systems of quantification that gave rise to the invention of money, which is also important in the fact that Chrysos was trying to impose a tribute on the Greeks. This importance has been underlined by several scholars. David Constant, it's on the handout as well, in an article entitled Persians, Greece and Empire, and another publication by Richard Seaford called Money and the Early Greek Mind. Since the invention of money is often attributed to the Lydians, and since the influence of Eastern and Egyptian ideas on Ionian thought is widely accepted, it is tempting to think that the principle of quantification behind the coming about of money could also have a say in the invention of history. After all, history is a genre that quantifies time and keeps track of the main events taking place in a causal succession. But this is a ramification of my research that I have not explored sufficiently yet, and that I'm leaving for another occasion. Thank you.